How would you feel? How would we feel as fans if the Texas Longhorns did not host a spring game this year? Right? How would we feel if they went forward with the decision to not host a spring game? We discuss on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, the spring game. Texas may not be hosting a spring game this year. Once again, how would you feel if you did not have that spring game in April that you're so accustomed to see the early versions of this 2025 Texas football team? In the second segment, J.D. Pickell from On3 released a list, the teams that are set up the most for success over the next 3 seasons. And Texas is at the top of the list. So we discussed that in the second segment. And then in the last segment, Inside Texas posed the question of where Trey Johnson's potential, even though we know he's going to the NBA after this, where's Trey Johnson's potential one-and-done season rank amongst some of the best one-and-done seasons at the University of Texas? I give my thoughts on that. All of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hope everybody is dealing with this inclement weather well, right? It's gotten really cold in the state of Texas again. To all my Texas listeners, which I'm assuming is the majority of my base, it's gotten really cold again. I see some snow in the Dallas area. So it feels like 1 degrees. It's, real cold in the teens in Houston, just real cold all over the state of Texas. So hope everybody's staying warm and like I said, doing well with this inclement weather, right? So talking about the spring game, I got to looking because I'm like, spring practices and the spring game, should be coming up. Like, has that schedule been announced? And I actually saw some stories from a few weeks back about how they were pondering about not having a spring game at all, right? So I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Because I felt like normally we would know by now the spring schedule or have a pretty good idea of it. And we're seeing, I guess, some teams cancel their spring game. Now, like Matt Rule in Nebraska canceled theirs, but I think that was more so for different reasons, right? He was talking about how he didn't want to have a spring game and then basically like have the spring portal window right after, where basically like all these teams are watching Nebraska and be like, oh, I want him. And because he was like, there's no such thing as tampering anymore. Like, basically, I guess saying like tampering won't be penalized. Like they can just come after your roster. And so he was like, why would I host an open tryout, for other people to come pick apart my roster, which makes sense. I think that, you always got to think about the fans, but at the end of the day, it's not really a coach's job to worry about the fans. It's a coach's job to worry about winning games and retaining talent. So you understand that. Steve Sarkisian, when he spoke on it, he kind of said that he thinks that spring football and just kind of spring football as a whole will end up being a casualty in terms of, the college football playoff expansion, the transfer portal and things like that. Like just with the football season being played later and later into January, possibly even into February at some point, it's going to be hard to then turn right back around and conduct business as usual with spring football. And I completely understand that. But selfishly as a fan, the spring game is something you look forward to every year, right? And, just kind of to backtrack a little bit, I understand it. He talks about the wear and tear on his players after playing a 16-game schedule. And that makes a ton of sense, and so why they might not have a spring game this year or a traditional spring practice schedule. And, Steve Sarkisian, who's coached in the NFL, has talked about how the NFL model of like OTAs and mini camps might make more sense, especially if you're extending the season, because a team like Texas did play 16 games, right? You play 12 regular season games, then you play in the SEC championship, and then you play 3 additional games in the playoffs, and it could have been 17 if they made it to the national championship. So that's a lot of games to then turn around, basically a month and a half after and say, okay, now we're going to do spring practices and ramp up to this full contact spring game. So um, I get it. It's a lot, and there are other ways that, you can, and then I guess it cuts into like winter conditioning, right? Because you start winter conditioning late. And then if you cut out some of winter conditioning, that can just lead to more injuries and things of that nature happening. So, I do agree with Steve Sarkisian that it's kind of hard, with all these changes to college football to still implement, especially at a school like Texas where you're playing so many games and playing so late into the season, to still be able to implement spring football and have it go seamlessly. But selfishly, as a fan and as a content creator, I would hate not having a spring game. I understand it for sure. And it's not about me. It's not about, any of us as the fans. Obviously, we want that fan experience, but we want Texas to win more. We want these players to be healthy. But I remember when I started this podcast, end of January, February 2022, the first real big thing that I was covering on the podcast were the spring practices leading up to the spring game, right? And that was like the first opportunity we saw of Quinn Ewers in a Texas jersey, right? We all remember the big pass from Quinn Ewers to Isaiah Nayor in the spring game, right? But just those spring practices 3 times a week, leading up to the spring game, being able to see, who was starting, who was playing what position, what guys were making noise, who wasn't, things like that. Like that's just always a really big deal, especially at a school like Texas. And it always culminates with the fan experience, being able to go see an early glimpse of your football team in at the spring game every year in DKR for free, and you look at a team like this year, right? Even though Arch Manning did get a lot of playing time in the spring game last year, you're looking forward to seeing him as a starter, right? Like I said, Cedric Baxter probably wouldn't play in the spring game, but you're looking forward to seeing that running game. How does Jordan Washington look at tight end? How does some of these true freshmen look at wide receiver in the spring game, right? How does this defense look? Colin Simmons, Anthony Hill, things like that. So Jonah Williams, a true freshman, one of the highest graded recruits ever at the University of Texas. So, I completely understand just how like the changes to college football, the spring portal window, all of that kind of makes it hard, like Steve Sarkisian said, to, fully implement spring practices in the spring game the way that you used to. And, he said ultimately it may be a casualty and that may start this year, just because it doesn't make as much sense as it used to, especially with Texas playing 16 games to turn around and try to get ready for a spring game and just kind of put that wear and tear on the player's body. But selfishly, once again, as a fan, it just would feel so weird not having that spring game because, like I said, you just look so forward. You look towards it every year, right? It's just something that you're so excited about every year to see a glimpse of these players, especially in such a long off season. To see these players go out and perform that one day in April, it feels like it just holds you over. You know what I'm saying? It feels like it just gives you, okay, whew, you know what I'm saying? We got some football, right? And then that momentum carries you all the way into the season. So completely understand Steve Sarkisian's thought process, but selfishly as a fan, without the spring game moving forward, if that became a thing, I think it would be a sad day for Texas fans for sure. Quick word from our sponsors. And then once again, JD Piquel feels like Texas is set up for success more than any other team in the country over the next 3 seasons. So we discussed that. All right, today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by TurboTax. This is a message from sponsor Intuit. TurboTax Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering if you were going to get any money back. Now Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now, this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. All right. So once again, JD Piquel from On3, hashtag off-season content. All right. Who is set up most for the success over the next 3 years? But I'm over here talking about how fans would feel if there was no spring game. So hashtag off-season content. I'm there too, right? So who is set up the best for the next 3 years? Yes, Texas number 1, Oregon number 2, Georgia number 3, Ohio State number 4, Notre Dame number 5, Michigan number 6, Alabama number 7, LSU number 8, Tennessee number 9, and Texas A&M number 10. Oklahoma not being on that list is crazy, but I mean, the next 3 years, I guess they don't look like a top 10 program in college football. And I guess you could make a strong argument for all those other teams that they do. Let me look at it again and see if there's any like glaring omissions on there. Ohio State, Texas, no, yeah. I mean, maybe Penn State just because of some of the success they've had, but I mean, I'm not sure if they can just continue to reload the way that they have. And you don't know if James Franklin is going to be there in 3 years. Michigan, you have the number 1 quarterback, so that makes sense. But yeah, the thing about that list is it's kind of hard to tell in this new college landscape who will be most set up for success because, as we discussed in the last segment, there's so many changes, right? What will Texas roster look like over the next 3 years? What will all those other teams' rosters look like over the next 3 years? Who will enter the portal? Who will teams get out of the portal, right? I mean, because you could have looked at Texas A&M's roster in 2022 and said they're absolutely set up for success in a crazy way over the next 3 years. I mean, when they brought in the best recruiting class of all time, according to certain metrics, I mean, how could you argue that they weren't set up for success more than anybody over the next 3 seasons? And then what did that turn into? Right? So I feel like just college football at this point is damn near impossible to project 3 years ahead, But, because Texas is number 1 on the list. So let me not just invalidate the list, right? I understand where he's coming from. Because, like, when you look at Texas, you look at the continuity they've been able to have on the coaching staff, right? You just lost to Tashard Choice. I understand that. But it's a running back coach. You're going to miss his charisma. You're going to miss his personality. You're going to miss, his ability to recruit. You're going to miss, him kind of being larger than life. I said he didn't feel like a running backs coach. He felt like, an assistant coach, like Steve Sarkisian's right hand. But, you'll be able to replace a running back coach. But you've kept Kyle Flood, and that offensive line, just him being the offensive coordinator, but the offensive line has been such a huge part of Texas' success the last 3-4 years. Steve Sarkisian, obviously, he's not going anywhere. He just signed another extension. Pete Kwiatkowski, at least right now, he made the comments he likes to stay in his lane. He's compensated very well to be our defensive coordinator. It seems like he's going to be here, right? I know Johnny Nansen got a extension. Somebody else did, but either way, right? You have a lot of continuity on the coaching staff, and I would expect over the next 3 years, especially with the way that Texas is going to be competing at the top level of college football, I would expect that there's going to be a lot of continuity. Now, of course, people are going to be coming in and kind of picking at the staff, and people are going to leave for the right opportunities for sure. But for the most part, I believe that Texas will be able to keep the core of this staff in place. And as long as the core of this staff is in place, then Texas should still be able to field a really good football team like they've done the last 2 seasons and, 3 seasons, I would say. They did go 8-5, right? It's not the worst thing in the world, especially coming off of 5-7. Then you look at the quarterback position, right? Because I think if you're projecting any team success over the next 3 seasons, it would have to be largely based on how well equipped you think they are at the quarterback position. Okay. Well, we know this year we have Arch Manning. And you can make the argument that Arch Manning is maybe the best quarterback coming into college football this year. Certainly the most intriguing, right? And so you would say, okay, Texas is set up really well at quarterback this next season. And then over the next 3 years, there's likely, unless you dip into the portal, right, which would be the unknown, there's likely some combination of not Trey Moore. Trey Owens, and KJ Lacey under the guise of Steve Sarkisian. If Arch Manning stays more than 1 year, even better. But the quarterback position does look really good under Steve Sarkisian for the next 3 years. And so you say, okay, the staff probably largely going to stay in place, right? The quarterback position looks well equipped under Steve Sarkisian for the next 3 years. Then you look at the defense, right? And you say Pete Kwiatkowski's unit since 2022, the last 3 seasons, has been really, really good. Now they have lost a lot of talent, especially up front in the middle, but you have a lot of talent on this defense, right? You look at it the next 3 years, you're going to have Jonah Williams on it. The next 2 years, you're going to have Colin Simmons on it. This year, you got hella talent on that defense, right? And so you would expect, based on what you saw the last 3 years, that Pete Kwiatkowski will have a really, really good unit over the next 3 seasons. You can't project what's going to happen in the transfer portal, but every year Texas is bringing in top 5 classes, right? This year, they brought in the number 1 recruiting class in college football. And so if you have the number 1 recruiting class in college football, then you should be well set up for success over the next 3 seasons, because that is the class that is going to be matriculating in to the starting lineup. And in 3 years, the majority of your starters or the majority of your impact players should be from this recruiting class. So I think that when you look at Texas over the next 3 seasons, even though there's a lot of unknowns in college football, and I didn't even talk about the skill positions, right? But from that recruiting class, you have 3 5-star receivers. But we know that when you have the offense that Steve Sarkisian does, being able to get playmakers that want to play in it, it's not the hardest job in the world, right? So, yeah, I mean, like I said, it's hashtag offseason content. We don't really know what any of these teams will look like over the next 3 years or 3 years from now. So much can happen. So much can change. You know, Ohio State won a championship and their defensive coordinator left. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, you don't know what, you know what I mean? Like, you really don't know. You know, you just really don't know. But when you look at the coaching staff, when you look at the quarterback position, when you look at what the defense has done the last 3 years, when you look at the skill positions we fielded the last 3 years, and when you look at having the number 1 recruiting class in the country and you probably being at worst top 5 every year moving forward in the Steve Sarkisian era, then it's hard to argue that another team has a better 3-year outlook than the University of Texas, especially when year 1 starts with Arch Manning and year 3 would culminate with the number 1 recruiting class in the country being juniors. So thank you, JD Piquel. I do think Texas is set up for success really well over the next 3 seasons. But, you know, like I said, college football has become the ultimate unknown, and we just got to kind of let it play out. Quick word from the sponsors, and then we talk about Trey Johnson, right? Where does he rank among famous Texas one-and-done seasons? All right. Okay. All right. I went to another tab and I felt like it like messed it up. So Inside Texas had, I guess, the question or the thought of like where Trey Johnson's freshman season ranks amongst Texas basketball one and dones. And I thought that it was a very interesting, thought process. I mean, when you look at it, Trey Johnson has been arguably a lone bright spot on a team that a lot of people feel like has underachieved up until this point, but the good thing about college basketball is that they still have a lot of story to be written. You know what I mean? They can still go out there and make a bunch of noise in the SEC tournament or the NCAA tournament and, kind of change the narrative. I think what makes Trey Johnson so interesting, right, and why there have been so many comparisons to Kevin Durant is because when you look at a lot of the best players that Texas has had, a lot of them have been big men, right? But it's been rare that Texas has had just a 3-level scorer on the wing that could take over a game at any point. And it feels like we really haven't necessarily had a guy like that since Kevin Durant, right? And so that's why as soon as Trey Johnson got on campus, the Kevin Durant kind of comparisons, started to take shape, even though he's not Kevin Durant. And, Kevin Durant, you're talking about one of the greatest basketball players of all time, right? But Trey Johnson certainly looks like one of the best players we've had on the 40 acres since Kevin Durant, right? You're talking about 6'6". He just won his 4th freshman of the week in the SEC, averaging 28.6 rebounds and 3.5 assists in 2 games last week. Like I said, 6'6", a 3-level scorer. You talk about what he's been able to do. He leads Texas in minutes per game, shots made per game, shots attempted per game, and free throw percentage. 19.8 points per game, and leads the SEC by over 1.5 points, right? He scored 475 points in just 24 games. And we're talking about a true freshman, right? Stepping on the court, a diaper dandy, like Dick Vitale would say. So he's immediately stepped on the court from day one, right? Where he broke Kevin Durant's record in the game against Ohio State. I think he had 28 points. Most points by Texas freshmen in their debut. So he's immediately stepped on the court and been one of the best players in the country, potentially could be an All-American this season. And so, when you look at it, I think that obviously Kevin Durant, just him winning player of the year, averaging 26 points, 11 rebounds, 2 blocks a game. We'll probably never see another freshman come to the University of Texas and do that, right? But like I said, you're talking about one of the greatest basketball players of all time. But I think if you're comparing him to any other, one and done, right? If you're talking about, like Mo Bamba, Tristan Thompson, Miles Turner, Jackson Hayes, Jared Allen, Avery Bradley, Corey Joseph, a bunch of guys like that, I'm willing to say that Trey Johnson is right behind KD. Like I said, just the ability to come in from day one and be a 3-level scorer, be an All-American candidate, be one of the best players in the country, to lead the SEC in scoring when we've talked about how good the SEC is this season, to practically be carrying a Texas basketball team that, probably would already be out of the tournament discussion if it wasn't for him. He's just absolutely electric. And it sucks that we're only going to have him for 1 year. It sucks that year might not lead to any postseason success, but then again, when we had Kevin Durant, we only won one, game, didn't make it to the Sweet 16. But yeah, I'm willing to say that Trey Johnson, based on what we've seen, is probably the second best one and done season ever at the University of Texas, behind the Slim Reaper, Kevin Durant. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hook 'em. Peace.